Today is actually January 5th, 2017. I'm pre-recording an interview with Mr. Dave Ratcliffe, who is the owner of Radical.org. That's how I found him. As you know, I follow John Goffman's books, and I bought many of his books on the exposure of low-level radiation. And through finding out how do I get permission to read this on the internet, I traced it all the way back to Dave. So, Dave, thank you for joining our show.
Glad to be here, Lonnie.
It's really awesome. So, you have been instrumental in archiving the work of Dr. John Goffman, correct?
Yes, I had that privilege.
Yeah, and that's actually where we can go on Radical.org. We can find a lot of the documents for John Goffman on there, right?
Yes, portions of some of the books he wrote, a complete copy of some others, and quite a number of articles and papers and talks that he gave.
What drove you to doing this? I mean, you started it 1995. What drove you to actually deciding to put this on what was brand new then, the Internet?
It was an organic process. I had in the 80s found my way to a couple of books that were of great interest. They were eye-opening. They expressed things for which I felt a lot of concern intuitively about manipulating matter in terms of the generation of artificial radioactivity through processes that I used to only be vaguely aware were what happened that became the Manhattan Project during World War II with the development of the atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan. But actually, and did you read the piece that we talked about the other day, Atomic Energy Origins of the Fallacy in a Risk-Free Radiation Dose?
Yes, I did. And I actually said, I don't think you had a chance to respond, but I'd love to read that on my YouTube channel and share that with people.
Okay, so that's something you're still going to put out. Good. Okay. So that piece, I wrote that last August, and I wanted for a long time to draw in things that connect back really to the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, with Wilhelm Röntgen, who discovered what he called the X-ray in 1895, calling it X because it wasn't clear what it was. And that really began for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945, a period of, and with Madame Curie and her discoveries of through radium and other things, of aspects of what radioactive matter is and what its properties are. And so in the 80s, I came across two books. One was something by a woman named Leslie Freeman called Nuclear Witnesses. And it was a series of chapters about, I'm just looking back to it so I can describe this correctly. Nuclear Witnesses, Insiders Speak Out, from W.W. Norton, 1981, and then the paperback I found was 82.
It's called Nuclear Witnesses?
Nuclear Witnesses, Insiders Speak Out. And it consisted of interviews with 9 individuals, quote, who have worked with or around nuclear materials. And I was very struck by this book. There was 3 people in there particularly that I read over and over a couple of times because I hadn't read things like this before. One was Rosalie Bertell, a mathematician and medical researcher. One was Dr. Ernest Sternglass, a physicist. And the third was John W. Goffman, medical physicist. And I'm not trained at all in background in the sciences per se. I've enjoyed piano a great deal in my life. I worked in a computer company for 15 years from the mid-'80s to the end of 2001, beginning of the 21st century. I had other things that I did, but I was just concerned as a member of the human family about what it seemed to me were tremendous risks that were being breached by generating very, very lethal toxic matter that would stay so for much, much, much longer than any kind of measurement of recorded beyond human history, proto-human history, 125,000 years ago, 125,000, with the dawn of humankind apparently in the Middle East, maybe, if the current assessment is accurate. And so Nuclear Witnesses was one book that really grabbed me, especially with those few chapters. The other one was Dr. Rosalie Bertell's No Immediate Danger, Prognosis for a Radioactive Earth. And that's from the book publishing company out of Summertown, Tennessee, came out in 1985. And both of those books were very significant to my own sense of concern about this aspect of technology in the 20th century dealing with things nuclear. And as is described at the beginning of the atomic energy piece I mentioned a moment ago, I'd like to read this from Dr. Gordon Edwards, the president and co-founder of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. He gave a talk in 2015 on high-level radioactive waste, and I've transcribed some of it. I haven't transcribed all of it, but nearer to the beginning, he says, let's begin with the word nuclear. What is nuclear? Why do we use this word? Basically, a simple answer is nuclear energy is energy that comes from the nucleus. The nucleus being the core of an atom. Every atom has a tiny core called the nucleus, very massive, and it's surrounded by one or more orbiting electrons. These electrons are negatively charged, and the nucleus itself is positively charged. Chemical energy involves only the outer electrons. So every chemical reaction you've ever seen portrayed on television, big explosions, tanks firing things, or cooking in the kitchen, all the changes that take place, all the industrial changes that take place in chemical plants, all of it involves only the electrons. It doesn't involve the nucleus. Nuclear energy is energy that comes directly from the nucleus, and it is typically millions of times more powerful than any chemical energy. And that's why it's rather difficult sometimes to grasp the scale of nuclear energy, because things which are extremely tiny can be giving off an incredible amount of energy. There are two types of nuclear energy in particular to discriminate between. The first one is called nuclear fission, and that's the splitting of uranium atoms, for example. That's what really gives the juice in a CANDU, C-A-N-D-U, it's an acronym, CANDU nuclear reactor. That's what really produces the bulk of the heat that's used to produce steam to generate electricity. But there's another form of nuclear energy called radioactivity, specifically. Now, it's very important to understand that these are different things. Nuclear fission is a process which can be controlled. It can be speeded up, it can be slowed down, it can be stopped, it can be started. Radioactivity cannot be controlled that way. Nobody knows how to speed it up, how to slow it down, how to stop it. You can't shut it off. And that's why we have a nuclear waste problem, because this radioactivity, enormous amounts of radioactivity, cannot be shut off. There's the problem in a nutshell. Nobody knows what to do about it. Although some people think they have an answer, we're not sure if that answer is correct or not. And I like that because it's very clear. He's a mathematician, he's trained, he has PhD, but he's very good at making technical things understandable to lay
That
people.
was very insightful, because this is one of the things I've struggled with. I've been covering this for 3 years, and I still, many times I say, like, I still don't get it, but that is actually very concise and clear. I've heard him speak. I heard that speech. I've heard him speak many times, and he is extremely articulate. He's extremely awesome.
He's very good. He's able to bridge that which is so much, as you just described, unknowable or inaccessible for lay people who don't have that kind of science training or educational background beyond, say,
like, I don't actually think science. You know, and I'm a more intuitive, from the heart kind of person. Like, I don't do well in science classes. You know what I mean? Like, I did well when I took my science classes, but I had to take the easier science classes, like oceanography and terrestrial science. You know what I mean? The physics things was completely no bueno. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, though, is this idea. What do you think of this idea? I think one of the things we can do to move this whole process along about stopping nuclear is to change the language. Like, I pretty much don't call ourselves anti-nukers. I call ourselves nuke truthers, because we want the truth about nuclear. And I also think that we need to stop calling it waste. It's a byproduct. It's a toxic byproduct for which we have no answer. Because when you say waste, it's kind of like the acronym, how they call them plants, like to make us think that it's a nuclear power plant kind of is an image of a tree or a flower or something, right? They use the words to sort of subtly change how we respond to the assault on our environment. I mean, there is no like I had this nuclear scientist on Twitter kind of hounding me saying nuclear is the best, from cradle to, it's the cheapest thing out there. And I said, actually, it's not. If you follow it from cradle to grave, and the problem is there is no grave. There is no dealing with this. That is the fundamental core answer of what's wrong with how we currently use it. We are contaminating the planet with every day a nuclear facility continues its operation.
There's that cost, and there is that many things that are never actually factored in by people who say this is a good thing and we should continue and expand this. But like so many things in a corporate kind of governed societal world, the real true costs are very, very rarely added up and explained and described, because were they to be, it would paint a different picture than what the claims might be of what it really takes to do this or that activity. So the words are tricky things for sure. And I agree that waste, David Freeman, who worked in Carter administration, I heard him speak on a radio program Helen Caldicott did for 4 years, If You Love This Planet, and we really need to get away from this idea of nuclear waste. Call it radioactive trash.
Right.
Make it something that's much more tangible, that's not a meme almost, that has almost no meaning left because it's thrown about so much, but it covers for something that's more dynamic and more fresh in some way of being the way it's thought about. The thing, in some levels, the issue I think sometimes can come up with something like saying truther. There was a lot of flack and a lot of disinformed, misinformed.
True. In fact, that's how I got it.
Well, with the whole 9/11 thing, and 9/11 is a huge, huge subject, and there's a lot there, and the aspect of the truther movement, I don't even know, is there something about Obama's birth certificate that were the truthers connected to that? Anyways,
maybe we need to rework that new phrase. Okay, so I appreciate your candor on that, because really, what I'm attempting to do, and what I'm really determined to do, is change the conversation so that we actually make a dent. I mean, you've been doing this for 95. Your site, radical.org, has been up and running since 95, and yet the nuclear industry is just continuing to steamroller over all of us without regard to human life.
So that's very true. There's Ralph Nader just came out a book, Breaking Through Power. I think that's the name of it, Breaking Through Power. He gave a great talk on the book in either the fall, I think in the fall, at City Lights Books in San Francisco. I think they were the publisher for it. And he was pointing out that the NRA, they don't have protest marches. For them, it's all 435. 435, 100 people in the Senate and 335 people in the House, and they have 9 or whatever people that are dedicated to each one of those 435 legislators. They don't go out in public and they concentrate on where those rules get made in a corporate state. And he said about AIPAC with the influence of the Jewish lobby, Israeli lobby. And he was quoting either a senator or a congressperson who was saying, yeah, I voted for AIPAC, but I didn't really want to, but I just wanted to get them off my back. I just didn't want to have to deal with them. I didn't have the time for that. So they were lobbied enough, targeted with that kind of pressure that a lot of interest groups like that, including the nuclear industry, they can bring to bear that kind of pressure through the for-profit world we're in. It's very, very, very tightly coupled in that way. I want to go back just a little bit to what you initially asked of how did I get into this. Those 2 books that I mentioned, Nuclear Witnesses and No Immediate Danger, I got in the early 90s, I started putting things onto news groups. The initial stuff I was interested in was health effects of nuclear technology and the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of JFK. And I had access in the early 90s. I found some, at that time, very sophisticated optical character recognition, OCR, software that I got my hands on with a scanner. I had the computers, of course, and I scanned in out-of-print books and out-of-print articles on both of those topics that I was interested in. And then I cleaned them up in text form and I posted them out to these news groups. This was before there was a web. The internet had existed since really the 70s, the 80s. DARPANET, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration, as a means of a way that scientists could confer with each other in different sites, at different laboratories, at different institutions through an electronic medium. And so it was just, you had these dumb text terminals, 80 columns by 24 rows. There was no font. It was all Courier. There was no bold or italic or different point size. It was just text on a dumb terminal screen, and you could pan through whatever that way in a very sort of primitive, but at that point effective means of communicating information. And I was fascinated by how I could scan these things in, clean them up, proofread them, make sure they were textually correct and replicated from the original paper copy, and then post these out to these different news groups. I was fascinated by that and very, very interested in the back and forth that it would engage, people that I began to meet electronically through that means. And then by 93, 94, this prototype web browser called Mosaic by the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Urbana, Illinois, this thing called Mosaic came out. Mark Andreessen was one of the creators of it. He then, in time, I worked at a company called Silicon Graphics. It was a computer company. Its founder, Jim Clark, came out of Stanford in 1982-ish or so with a group of graduate students he had. He had this idea that you could make 3D real-time computer graphics in a computer that could generate a very, very complex model like the space shuttle with millions of polygons defining its surface. And then you could have lighting models and all this stuff in math and use a series of chips of hardware to do matrix transformations with linear math, linear algebra, from 3-space to 2-space, including all the lighting calculations and everything. And he tried to interest places like Hewlett-Packard in this design that he had invented and developed for visual simulation. And places like HP said, why would you want to do that? They weren't interested. So he founded his own company called Silicon Graphics. I had taken about 8 years out of undergrad school because I knew I didn't know what I wanted to get a degree in. I went back to school in 83. I wanted to get do a graphics senior thesis at UC Santa Cruz. And in the fall of 85, when I was graduating, they had in our graphics group this guy come from Silicon Graphics, an engineer and a salesperson, to talk about their machines. And they brought one of the machines in. It was really, really neat to see it. It did all this real-time stuff. It was very, very powerful. And I wanted to go get a job there, and I did. And I worked there for 15 years in tech support. And it was a very interesting view into an aspect of the technological world. And it gave me all kinds of other access into stuff to do with computers, which I literally backed up into in 1983 after I thought I wanted to be a performance pianist, performance musician, and realized I'm just not obsessive enough, that all I want to do is practice every day and play every night, which I knew is what it would take. So I did this other thing ended up doing that ride for 15 years. It was a heck of a ride. It gave me all kinds of access to many, many things, including this way of digitizing out of print text in whatever forms. So by 94, then I was thinking, okay, here's this Mosaic thing. This is going to be a great front end for what I deliver, doing technical support for developers, third-party hardware and software developers that used our machines. It was a complete hardware and software system. It used the Unix operating system, which Mac put under its hood in the mid-90s or in the 1990s, I forget exactly when, a very shrewd move by Macintosh. Unix is a very, very powerful operating system that was developed by Bell Labs in the 1960s. Very bulletproof, very well conceived, very different from the DOS operating system of Microsoft. And so that was what I knew. That was what I worked with on the guts level, on the system admin level for years. And by 94, I was thinking, maybe I could make my own little site. Mark Twain said at some point, or quoted as saying, when he retired, he wanted to move to a small town and run a newspaper himself. Mm-hmm. Now, in the 1990s, you could start to envision doing that on the web. And I thought of myself, I could manage my little corner of the virtual stacks of the coming electronic world library. In the 70s, reading science fiction books by Philip K. Dick and others, I had this sense that somewhere in the future, everybody will have in their house this port, this terminal port, this visual window that they can dial into the world library with.
So in the 90s, you were thinking this?
No. In the 70s, I was thinking.
Wow.
I thought, reading those kind of books and projecting, someday there'll be an electronic world library. And so by the time, and once I started to see Mosaic and these other things in the 90s, it just was right there. And so I asked permission. I got permission from W.W. Norton to put the 3 chapters that I mentioned, Rosalie Bertell, Ernest Sternglass, and John Goffman from Nuclear Witnesses, into hypertext, into a form on the internet, on the website that I launched in September of 95, radical.org. And I got permission from the book publishing company in Summertown for the first section of Rosalie Bertell's book, No Immediate Danger. Part 1, The Problem, Nuclear Radiation and Its Biological Effects. And those chunks of information were some of the first things that I put together in 1995, 1996. And I'd already contacted Egan O'Connor. Egan was she's still alive, John Goffman's executive assistant and director of the nonprofit Committee for Nuclear Responsibility. The founder of that was Lenore Marshall, a United States poet, in 1971. And Goffman became the chairman of this nonprofit. And it did incredible work, primarily through his research, his study, and then his writing and publishing of, again, information that was very, very much accessible to anyone with a high school education. You didn't have to have any kind of higher education science background if you were interested, if you wanted to know about it, to read what he would write, and then he'd explain all of the data, show all the tables and everything, and explain how he reached his conclusions. He was an extraordinarily gifted man. How much have you already talked about John Goffman's own life?
Not much, to be honest. Not, at least on this radio show, not very much. On my YouTube channel, I've read 2 of his books. I've read Nuclear Population Control Through Nuclear Pollution and Poison Power. I'm currently reading The Human Radiation Studies, Remembering the Early Years, Oral History of Dr. John Goffman, conducted by the United States Department of Energy. It was conducted in 1994. So I'm reading that right now to kind of get a history, because this is one of the things that interests me quite a bit, is the forgotten history. This is exactly what they've done with Goffman. They've demonized him and subverted the information that he's had. And so just for posterity's sake, and because people in America don't read, I decided that I'm just going to read to them. You know, I mean, there are people that are actually listening to me doing these readings. It blows me away, but they actually do listen. I've read other articles on my YouTube channel, which is Nuts for Art. I read this Safety of Nuclear Power by Dr. Alvin M. Weinberg, who was very pro-nuclear, and it's a very telling article. That's the first time that they used the term Faustian bargain, and it's also the first time they called themselves the nuclear priesthood. So my whole thing is about, we can't fix what we don't know about. That's why when I saw your webpage, which is Radical, R-A-T-A-C-I-L, not R-A-D. It's Radical, R-A-T-I-C-A-L.
R-A-T-I-C-A-L.
That's right. That's right. R-A-T-I-C-A-L. And it is a very fascinating page, because you have a lot of different ideas here. I mean, it's not just focused on nuclear. This is the thing, Dave, let me ask you this. And I asked this of many of the people that have been engaged in this. As I said earlier, they're just steamrolling along on it, and I think until we get enough people to understand that we are being intentionally misled. And it was kind of a little bit of serendipity. Before the show, I was asking you how to introduce you, and you said you are currently a member of the Museum of Hidden History. I seem to think that that sort of goes along with this whole theme of John Goffman's work, because it is hidden history. Mm-hmm. Do you see, and the same thing with the 9/11, you were interested in the JFK murder. I tend to think that the same people that murdered JFK perpetrated 9/11. That's my feeling. I'm just going to put it out there. But that also is the hidden history. Is that part of this hidden history that we're talking about? I mean, do you see kind of like a common thread between any of this?
Jefferson at some point remarked in so many words that an informed democracy will behave in a responsible manner. And Franklin said something along the lines of, I probably won't get this one right, if you're willing, you could be willing to trade in your freedom for security, and you'll have neither. That's not the way he said it, but and even beyond that, if you think about how the people who lived here long before, ages, thousands and thousands of years before the Europeans came to this continent, and the way of life that we could say was and still attempts to be indigenous of the land, from, might as well say, time immemorial, or at least for as long as human habitation of this North American continent was engaged. The creation of the United States was something that happened at the expense of the peoples, of the nations, of the communities that had been here for so long before contact with Europe. And yet the way that you have the founding fathers and the different rousing stories of this land of the free and home of the brave, it's a misnomer. It's very non-inclusive.
Right.
It's very selective.
That's right.
So
I mean, think about it, Dave. Not one nation, not one of the First Nations came out of this unscathed by the European invasion. There isn't one nation that's intact. Not one nation that's intact on the North American continent as it was when they came.
And another thing that I more of late have thought of is, if we go back 5,000 to 10,000 years, which is not that long when you think of how long the human project has been ongoing here, in whatever way, maybe you could go back 125,000 years to whatever the records indicate at this point, or the earliest proto-human evidence of proto-human on the planet. But we go back only 5,000 or 10,000 years. All of us, it can be said, are descended from our indigenous ancestors. So it's not as if somehow the people who were the earliest inhabitants of this continent are somehow different from us if we go back far enough in our ancestry. And as a kid, I had this sense of the iniquity and the changes that were wrought by people who in some ways did not understand what they were doing. Kind of like what apparently Jesus Christ was supposed to have said on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And I think there's a lot of forgetting, like you're saying, hidden, forgotten or unknown history. There's a lot of male dominance in all that. It's his story. It's not something more inclusive than that.
But that. You're telling me, Dave.
Well, it's when tyranny is when the partial masquerades as the whole. That's where tyranny comes in.
Yeah.
And we have a world that is very split. It's very fragmented, with the male dominator culture so bereft of its own holistic connection to every male's mother, the female, the Mother Earth, the whole.
Again, intentional. Don't you think it's intentional, Dave? Because separated people are easy to manipulate.
It's intentional, but I think it's also, there's an unconsciousness there in some respects that is actually, I think it's both. I think it's more difficult to make something just be this or that.
True.
I think it's something that can be anded, this and this and this and this, perhaps can get closer to touching on more of the dynamic of what we find ourselves living in today.
Yeah.
So anyways, let's go back to Goffman for a minute. I have this, I was very, very fortunate. I reached out to Egan and John because I knew about the Committee for Nuclear Responsibility in about was either 93 or 94, because I wanted to put Poison Power online. I wanted to get their permission. This was actually when I was still just doing stuff on the news groups. This was before I knew that there was going to be this thing called the web. And I made an initial contact. Egan was basically the liaison, and she was very encouraging and interested. And then I got caught up I did this whole series on the nuclear establishment on the news groups, and I didn't get around in that production phase to scanning in and completing Poison Power, but I still wanted to do it. So then I came back to Egan in 94, I think it was, and started to work directly because they were very happy that somebody was interested in digitizing some of John's work. So by 95, I was much more directly in communication with them. I was south of San Francisco, about 90 miles in Santa Cruz on the north end of the Monterey Bay, and they were up in the city. And so nobody else was doing that yet, certainly hadn't contacted him. So I was able to have them send me different articles. They'd write these mailers, this spring renewal thing and this fall renewal thing, and he'd have an article that he'd written, this, that, or the other, that would accompany it. And they'd either send me 5 1/4 inch old PC truly floppy diskettes that I had a way of translating onto the Unix machine I had that was not PC, or they just send me the paper copy and I'd scan it in and go at it that way. And it was a very, very rich relationship that we had. I was so happy to be contributing something of making John's work available to a much wider audience. And they were very, very excited at the prospect up to the time that the web existed by 94, 95. John Goffman had never conceived that there would be any way that a wider swath of people anywhere in the world who could get access to a computer could see and read what he'd put together. So finally, last year, September of 2015 was the 20-year mark of Radical. So starting at the beginning of that year, I put out 4 different essays that I wrote celebrating 20-year cycle anniversary. And the 4th of those was what I published on the September equinox, really in the month of the year that I had started it 20 years before, on John. And I wrote it was called Dr. John W. Goffman, His Life and Research on the Health Effects of Exposure to Ionizing Radiation. And I just revisited this up to yesterday, updating it. I went back through it again because I knew it needed a reread, and I had a lot more from the time I wrote this 15 months ago. I've since then had occasion to digitize more of things that he wrote that I've wanted to for a long time. Is
that the same article that's on the front page of your website?
Yes.
Awesome.
This is, if somebody goes to radical.org and they pan down a little bit, you'll see 4 pictures of John from when he's younger to when he's older, black and white shots, with this title, Dr. John W. Goffman, His Life and Research on the Health Effects of Exposure to Ionizing Radiation. And the abstract for this thing, I want to write a biography on him, and I figure it's going to take a number of years to do that, and that's fine. But the abstract reads like this. Beginning in 1995, I was grateful for the opportunity to work with Dr. John Goffman and his assistant Egan O'Connor building a digital archive of a portion of his written works. Dr. Goffman did more than most other medical scientists to warn people about the health effects and dangers of exposure to low-dose radiation. He earned a PhD in nuclear physical chemistry at UC Berkeley in 1943, where his graduate advisor was Glenn Seaborg. He co-discovered uranium-232 and 233 and was the leader of the plutonium group at UC Berkeley for the Manhattan Project, where he produced the first 1.2 milligrams of plutonium for J. Robert Oppenheimer. He went on to receive his MD degree from UCSF in 1946. He successfully identified high-density and low-density lipoproteins and made a number of other major discoveries involving cholesterol, coronary heart disease, arteriosclerosis, and especially cancer. In 1963, he was asked by the Atomic Energy Commission to establish and become the first director of the Biomedical Research Division at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to study, quote, implications of all nuclear energy programs upon man in the biosphere, unquote. In 1969, he and his colleague, Dr. Arthur Tamplin, publicly concluded that the dangers of exposure to low-level ionizing radiation were much greater than previously acknowledged, and that there was no evidence of a risk-free dose of radiation. By 1973, the U.S. government had defunded Goffman's Livermore lab research on chromosomes and cancer. He returned to teaching full-time at UC Berkeley and chose an early and active retirement in 1974 as Professor Emeritus of Molecular and Cell Biology, devoting the next 30 years to pro bono research into human health effects from radiation. Dr. Goffman produced a wealth of published works that have increased understanding and awareness of the biological hazards of low-level ionizing radiation, and was a vital voice of intelligence and clarity, calling for the cessation of further nuclear pollution of grandmother Earth.
Wow.
And I've just finished, as I said, updating this thing. It's now not only there in hypertext, it's also, I've generated a PDF form, print-based, page-defined. It's 52 pages. It has 91 footnotes, endnotes in it. Most of them have links to the sources that I'm drawing upon, either on Radical or elsewhere. And it has about, how many different sections? Let's see. About 30 sections in it that it's like an outline of his life. It's something that I wrote with thinking, okay, this is something that I can leverage to then try and think about how I'm going to write a biography, because no one's ever written a biography.
Wow. That's pretty astounding that no one's written it by. Well, this again, it's the hidden history. People, I know myself, I didn't know who he was until maybe 2-3 years ago. In fact, I didn't even realize that nuclear radiation or radioactivity was even an issue. I grew up right next to, I say this all the time, but this will tell you how Americans have been brainwashed. I grew up right next door to San Onofre Nuclear Power Plant, lived there most of my life, traveled up and down the freeway. I thought it was an observatory for the Navy. I had no idea it was a nuclear power plant. Seriously, none. So when it got closed down, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's a nuclear power plant. And now we find that even though it's closed down, it is so highly radioactive, that section of the 405 freeway and where they store the tanks, the Navy will not take the land back. So that's where they're at down there. They're trying to figure out who's going to pay for the remediation of the land so the Navy can take it back. It's stunning. It's stunning the magnificent job they've done on brainwashing the American public.
This difficulty of having a for-profit system of motivation, healthcare,
right,
transportation, education, any form of it is founded on being able to see a profit, financial profit. And there's a challenge with that, because it certainly affords all kinds of great benefits, and there are a great deal of trade-offs that, as I said before, if there was a real cost accounting, like Buckminster Fuller with his cosmic cost accounting, a lot of these things wouldn't have happened, because it would basically be more inclusive of our indigenous ancestors' wisdom and understanding of how everything is interrelated.
That's right.
And nothing is separate.
That's right.
There's this wonderful piece from John Goffman was awarded the Right Livelihood Award in 1992 for his pioneering work in exposing the health effects of low-level radiation. And that was, he went over to Sweden to accept the award, and with people that he shared it with that year, other people that were also awarded. And his speech on December 9th, 1992 was called A Key Step in Protecting the World's Health. He also wrote a paper on the occasion of the award entitled Biomedical Unknowledge and Nuclear Pollution, a Common Sense Proposal, which of course is on Radical. And
I think I read that.
And in there he has one point where he writes, the question which demands an answer after, and I haven't square braced because he didn't actually say this, but I'm paraphrasing, after he lost his government funding for lab research at Lawrence Livermore. After that, returning full-time to my professorship at the University of California, I've been thinking about the implications for humanity of the conflict of interest problem. How can humanity have even the remotest chance of protecting its own health when an agent of poisoning the population is also the sponsor of virtually all the health research concerning the pollutant?
Exactly.
So it's this conflict of interest thing, and it's fine if it's clear that, okay, full disclosure, whatever that somebody has with an interest that they have in something that they're involved with, that maybe then they're invited to be on a panel to study something about it or whatever. But that is usually, well, there's all kinds of laws, there's ethics laws, supposedly, that try and safeguard against unaccountable behavior producing supposedly unintended consequences. But if you think to something like the formation of the national security structures in the United States post-World War II, 1947, and the passage of the National Security Act, essentially created a different layer of officials who were not elected, but most of them commanded a higher level of control than elected officials because they weren't accountable. They were national security managers.
Right.
And they trumped anybody who would have been in a publicly elected position, whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch, because they didn't have to describe anything about what they were about because it was national security, the cloaking device. And so that kind of unaccountability, the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, Goffman was hugely instrumental in tearing down and making it so bare bones, patently obvious how conflicted in interest the Atomic Energy Commission was, created after the war to supposedly have a civilian control of nuclear energy, both for weapons and power, inextricably linked those both are from the beginning. But the AEC did all of its most dangerous and toxic rulemaking without any accountability because it was all under the rubric of national security.
They're still unaccountable, Dave. Like that, the Committee on Science last week, I mean, Obama fired the scientist from the NRC, or for the Department of Energy, Metting. Her name is Metting, Metting. She cooperated with the science. They're trying to shut down the oversight committee on the investigation of ionizing radiation, low-level ionizing radiation, and so she was cooperating with the Congress about giving them information. She got fired. They actually withheld a lot of documents. The NRC and the Department of Energy is basically telling Congress, we're not giving you the information. And again, they're completely unaccountable. And this doesn't even speak to the secret government like the CIA, which has unlimited funding, no oversight at all, nothing. They're just a black hole of we pour our tax dollars in and hope they're doing the right thing. We've gotten way off track in this country, and it all started around that time.
Yes. And I mean, even though I must point out what you just referred to, My dear friend John Judge, who was the founder of the Museum of Hidden History, he died of complications from a stroke in April of 2014 at the tender young age of 66.
Wow.
But John was one of the most articulate, intelligent, encyclopedic memory of particularly the hidden history post-World War, during and post-World War II in the United States. And you just mentioned the CIA. But as I put in a footnote to a different article about John, a comparison John Judge made between the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and the CIA, and how much more cloaked and obscure the former was and is compared to the latter, is helpful. This cloaking dynamic is a tacit indicator of its significance. In 2004, John observed that, quote, 80% of the intelligence budget is controlled by the Pentagon, not by the CIA and the intelligence agencies on that executive side outside the Pentagon.
Wow.
And I've always said that the DIA, is the Defense Intelligence Agency, was the real thing to look at, because you can get 600 books on the CIA. I challenge you to get 2 or 3 on the DIA.
I'd never actually heard about the DIA up until this very second. So that's how deep it goes.
Let me finish. There's only 2 on the NSA, and they're both written by Bamford, the same fellow. For the Office of Naval Intelligence, I've found 5, and believe me, I look at books. And that's the oldest and largest intelligence agency. It started with British Naval Intelligence, ONI, and it's very hard to find out anything about them, even at the level of the war colleges and those things, and yet they control the base of the budget. What Prouty, L. Fletcher Prouty, and other histories tell us is that the CIA is essentially a think tank. It comes up with plots. It may penetrate or get information on or manipulate groups, but in the end, when they want to carry out a special operation, they have to find a liaison to the military intelligence, because the military intelligence has the equipment and the tools in order to actually affect any large-scale special operation, even an assassination. So Defense Intelligence Agency, so you haven't heard of it before. Keep your ears and eyes and mind out for anything you ever hear, or not, about DIA. And see if you come up with anything. There's been a little bit of mention of it lately, I've noticed, but it's very, very sparse. And so just to keep things in perspective, one thing about special psychological operations, psychological warfare operations, call it mind control, call it programming, call it propaganda, call it what you will, that has become developed to a very, very high level, certainly in the 20th century, with something like television, as ubiquitous as television. As John used to say, think of what the Nazis would have given for television. They would have cut off their saluting arms for television.
Yeah.
So there's a very, very deep level of influence on people everywhere, and it's getting harder and harder and harder to have any kind of training in finding people who have training in critical thinking, and just in being able to not necessarily hear what someone else says and think whatever they think is true, but to find out for oneself, what is it? And that's in a culture like this, that's much more driven by images than by being literate. It's shades of worlds gone by. It's shades of Germany in the 30s. In Radical, in November, I run a statistics thing every month. And I noticed that for November traffic to the site, very interesting, there was usually the highest one has been something that is actually, I just made up years ago a copy of the Bill of Rights.
Right, I saw that on there.
And that usually nets about 40,000 requests a month.
Wow.
So for November 2016, that was still, I'm looking at the November 2016 page right now, Bill of Rights logged 40,357.
Wow.
The one that came in above that, and I've never had one this high, was the 14 characteristics of fascism by Lawrence Britt.
Wow.
Spring 2003, Free Inquiry magazine. I saw stuff as I went through the years, and if it looked like it was significant, I made a copy of it and I put it on Radical. So it was like archiving, because a lot of the things, the original link, those things aren't there anymore. That one still is, amazingly.
Wow.
But even the original is still there. This one was requested 114,897 times.
Wow.
But, I mean, that's a reflection of what happened in November of 2016.
That was just recent. Well,
that was the month of the election.
Wow. Well, Dave, look, we are at the end of the hour, and I hope that you will be a friend of our show and come back again. I am completely delighted that I let you continue on that train of thought so we could get in that article about this, the signals of fascism, because that's a concern on most of our hearts. I mean, a lot of people are really have a lot of anxiety about what's going to happen as we see the Trump nation beginning to develop himself. So I think that it's not like 1932. I hope it's not. I hope we will actually begin to stand up to this and take it back. That's my goal in life. So, look, you have been listening to the Age of Fission radio show with Dave Ratcliffe with radical.org, ratical.org. Please do go to his webpage and explore it. There's a plethora of information, as you've heard just now. It's not just about John Goffman. It's not just about nuclear. It's about all of it. So, Dave, is there anything you'd like to tell our listeners before we end?
Just very grateful for this opportunity. And one thing that I'd like to talk more about is with regards to radioactive trash. There was a very interesting movie that came out in 2009 called Into Eternity, the film for the future. And I made a huge copy of the transcript of Helen Caldicott interviewing the director and narrator of that film. It's down inside of the radiation section. But also, and that was seemed like, wow, that's really amazing. The first country in the world that actually has in its law books to make this repository that's supposed to last for 100,000 years, which is not that long considering how long
it's going to last, exactly.
But they're trying to do something with it. And then with Gordon Edwards from this high-level radioactive waste talk that I mentioned earlier, I'd like to talk more about the concept of rolling stewardship, which is so much at odds with the current, if it's talked about at all, of dealing with all of this toxic matter, it's basically talking about abandoning it underground.
That's exactly right.
So rolling stewardship is the other thing. The other thing I encourage people to look at that's very, very exciting, it's very upbeat, it's very positive, it's very creative and constructive. On that main page, look forward, not too far down, it's before you get to the section that highlights John Goffman, the Montreal Declaration. The Montreal Declaration is a very, very exciting and wonderful development. It was launched in last August. And the subhead of it is Montreal Declaration for a Nuclear Fission-Free World.
Well, let's end on that, Dave. We're pressed up against time. Good. I appreciate you being with us. Thank everybody for listening to us. Put your courage feet on. Take some action. Please go to Dave's page, and we'll talk with you soon. Thank you so much.
Very good. Thank you. You're welcome.
Thank you.